My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with David Baker at his home in Corvallis. It is August 14th, 2017. And David, will start you off with a nice, easy question. Why wine?
Let's see. I started to become interested in wine. I grew up in the city in Chicago, and my mother was from Germany, so we always had kind of wine at the table and earlier access to wine, I guess, than most kids growing up. You know, it was sort of a fixture there. So, and I had some relatives in Germany who were in the wine industry a little bit, but I wasn't really that interested in it until I moved out of the city, and we moved to the country in Missouri, of all places. And at the same time that we did that, I traveled to France with my wife for the first time, and we stopped in the town of Beaune, which is the heart of Burgundy, maybe one of the great wine capitals of the world, not knowing it at the time. And we took a tour and went out into a vineyard there. So it just was really a captivating experience, seeing those old vines. I didn't know anything about them. I've learned a lot since. But when I came back to Missouri, I planted about a quarter acre of grapes and made plans to plant more, and started just getting interested in the process of growing grapes. And I just took online courses on viticulture and toured the local wineries in Missouri that were sprouting up at the time, and ended up working in a commercial vineyard as volunteer laborer for a couple of seasons, and so just found it more and more fascinating ever since.
So then, when you got to Oregon, did you continue to grow grapes here?
No, I kind of had thought in my mind when I moved here for job reasons. I worked at universities and still work at Oregon State University, and but I think this being a wine region was a reason that we chose here. I kind of chose on behalf of our family because of the fishing and the wine, very noted wine region. So I always thought I would get involved with wine somehow, and this seemed like a good place to do that. So definitely being in areas that grow grapes factored into our choice to move to Oregon, and one reason that we'll stay here and like it. But as far as getting involved with the industry, I always figured I would get more involved somehow, and didn't really know how. And it was through kind of the work that I do, writing and filmmaking, that I found a way in, and I've really enjoyed that aspect of it. Especially the first film, American Wine Story, is about all the sacrifices that people make to get into the wine business, and it was sort of a dose of reality of what it takes and the commitment, and so it was really daunting to learn what those folks went through. So I find myself more as an admirer of people who do that, because they make a lot of sacrifices and mortgage homes and cash in life savings to start and to get into the wine industry. It's not an easy path. So as an observer and sort of documenter of the wine industry, it feels like a good role.
So let's talk about American Wine Story a little bit. So what was the impetus to starting that project?
I'd always been involved in writing projects and scripting, news and video and that sort of thing. And I'd actually sold a screenplay option and had been involved a little bit in filmmaking, and always as a writer. Mm-hmm. And as a writer, you don't have any control over the product or the process. So you get called in, and then the film that was in development at the time, it ended up folding. The company folded, and there was the writer's strike, which kind of put a damper on the industry. So I wanted to make a film that, get into filmmaking where I could control it a little bit more as a director and producer. So I used the money from that sale of that script to buy a camera, and made some short films and things on the side, and American Wine Story kind of grew out of that. At the same time, True and Pence, who worked on the film as well, and I were touring wineries and hanging out with some people locally here, friends of ours who make wine. And every single one of them had a story of, like, I used to do this. And I think that was sort of a common thread in the types of wineries and the types of winemakers that we liked or that we gravitated towards that were accessible to us is that, and especially here in Oregon, it's like they all used to do something else. And so we thought that would be a great thread for the first story. And so we married that with the fact that, had a camera and decided to start making a film about that theme of what people used to do, what they gave up, and where they wound up. And also I think Oregon, more than a lot of other regions that might, or some of the other regions that are more established, has more of that pioneering aspect, or had at that time. There's sort of Wild West feel to it. So it's a great home for that story, and then we tried to expand it across the country.
And so what was the response as you were trying to tell that story locally and then also across the country? What was the response from people in the industry?
Well, I think that's one reason that you tell stories about winemakers, I think, is you've probably encountered, is that if you start talking with these folks, or if you go to a winery and you actually talk with the people that make the wine, and in the smaller producers, that's usually the case. It's usually somebody in the family or somebody directly connected to the process that is involved. They're such genuine people. A lot of times, when we do an interview and tell people what we want to do, first of all, they'd be a little baffled of why somebody would be interested, and then they'd be very busy. But then once you would arrive there and spend a couple of days with them, usually by the end of the first day, they're giving you a place to stay, or if they are really busy, you could tell the interview went really well because they'd say, "Hold on a second," and then they'd go in the back and you hear clink, 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 and they might come out with a bottle or two of some of their more special wines that they make, and they're very genuine people. So I think their response was, if they find that you're really interested in what they're doing, and you automatically have a connection, and I think that's one reason they get into winemaking as much as anything, is to connect with people. Wine's kind of a form of communication, and if you're receptive to that, then they can read that, and I think that's why so many people have so many great experiences visiting wineries and touring wine regions and things like that, because they sense that connection.
So I remember talking with you while you were working on the film, and you, as I recall, were still trying to figure out how to tie the full narrative together. So how did you kind of come to your final cut? How did you kind of decide the final order of things?
Yeah, that was a really challenging process, because we had we talked to about 60, 70 different people all across the industry, all around the country. A large number of them in Oregon, but California to Virginia too. And we had chapters. We organized everything into chapters. Like, here's the Epiphany bottle, and here is sort of the challenges, and here are the outliers. People growing grapes in regions where they were told they shouldn't. Oregon used to be one of those regions. The first winemakers that came up here, people thought they were crazy. They weren't really supported, or by the traditional structures. So we organized all those chapters, and we had this great sort of flood of information. But I think a story needs sort of a narrative arc, and it needs in a documentary, we'll call it like the train or the spine of the story, and we just didn't have that. So throughout, and I think probably around the time that we were in the archives, we had heard of the story of the Brooks Winery and of Jimmy Brooks, who's a Linfield College alum, and everywhere we went, we would fish for another story. Say, what are the great wine stories that we should cover? Who are the people we should talk to? And everybody said, "Oh, I'm sure you've talked to Brooks. That's this great story. This kind of young, eccentric winemaker came in the Oregon wine industry after he'd passed away, helped rescue the winery for his son." And we heard that so many times that we assumed it had been told in a film or something like that. So we didn't really go near it. But then towards the end, when we had this collection of material, we thought, well, that would be a great anchor story. It's got a great arc. So I reached out to Janie Brooks, and She was a little guarded at first, I think, but then went down to California and met with her and spent some time with her family, and then we knew that was the story. So we pieced that into the narrative, and we tied the chapters of Jimmy's and Janie's lives to these chapters that we'd already laid out, and it worked really well. It gave the audience sort of a couple of main characters to root for throughout the documentary, and that was sort of the missing piece.
So what would you hope audiences got out of American Wine Story?
I think it's certainly a wine story and focuses on the wine industry, and there's some genuine qualities in that. But I think you can extrapolate that to a lot of the sort of this really positive entrepreneurial American spirit, this pioneering kind of a spirit of starting over. People, sort of this whole that stems from a nation of kind of immigrants reinventing themselves and coming here and starting new lives and starting with not a lot and building something up. So I think that's a big part of it too. When we were out doing festivals and actually watching the film with audiences, it was always rewarding when somebody would come up and say, I'm not even interested in wine, but I like the film. Or I don't drink, but I really enjoyed the film, and they've talked about that. This is really about entrepreneurship. It's about sort of an American story. So, and I think that is one thing that was rewarding, is that it transcends the wine geeks and the wine lovers, and it reached a more general audience. But the other thing too was, a lot of people came up to me after the film, after screenings, and they're like, "Oh, where should I buy a vineyard? I want to start a vineyard now." and even though we don't really advocate for that, and the film try and almost scare people away from it a little bit, I think people are still inspired by the characters in the film, the real life stories, that they want to do this too. So you can see that spark of people who have been thinking about this, and it's been in their mind, and then they see the film, and then they want to do that. So that's really rewarding too. And I think it's not a film that's necessarily for everyone, but I think people in that spectrum, when they connect with it, they really enjoy it, and that's been rewarding to see. I'm surprised, pleasantly surprised that people are still watching it. It's still out there, and I hear of people doing screenings and ordering DVDs and things like that, so that it's still out there reaching. It feels like it has a little bit of life behind it. So,
what was the most surprising thing you learned in making the documentary, or surprising aspect of the industry?
I think what really hit home, and the thing that you never think about when you look at the wine industry, is that the hardest part is selling the wine, and that was a theme. And even the way, it's this wonderfully crafted product, and you have to plant grapes, and you have to take exquisite care of them, and then you have to really be careful about this process and keep everything clean to successfully make a bottle of good wine, and then to make sort of a wine that comes from a certain place, vineyard designate kind of wine, or higher quality wine where there's lots of fruit sorting happening and stuff like that. It's all hand labor, so it's really hard to do, and everybody says that's the easy part. They all say that the hard part is selling the wine. So that's sort of a sobering thing. It's kind of like you don't open a restaurant if you like cooking. You open a restaurant if you like spreadsheets and late nights and things like that, and managing people. In a winery, you have to. That selling part is the hard part, and that really hit home. And it was a surprise. That's nothing that anybody who gets into wine loves to do. So, unless, like, I think Janie Brooks, who's like a natural. Comes from the world of where sales skills. She just has a gift for that. So I think she's like perfect in the role of the head of Brooks Winery.
So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'm curious, in your words, like, what is it that makes wine special? Why write about it? Why make films about it? Is there a certain aspect of it to you that makes it special? Yeah,
I think the most fascinating thing about wine is how much is contained in a certain bottle. So you have a whole year worth of weather that's reflected in this bottle of wine. So it is, you know, a document. It's like a record or a time capsule of that particular year. And then you have millions years of geology and the shaping of geography that is reflected in that same bottle. So, and then you have, you know, if it's in Oregon, maybe it's 40 years. If it's in Burgundy, it's 2,000 years of human history reflected in that bottle. And then at the very top level, you have the personality and the beliefs and the convictions of the person who made it in there. So you have all these different levels in, you know, that just kind of happen to be encapsulated in this product. And other winemakers have mentioned this to me too. It's like one of the few products in the world. It's an agricultural product and it's an industrial product. So it's manufactured, it's grown, and it's sold usually in many cases by the same person, who you go into a tasting room and a lot of times you make an appointment with a winemaker or owner of a small winery, and that's the person who's been involved at every stage of it too. So how many products in the world, you know, most farmers, they grow something, maybe you can go to the farmer's market and experience that a little bit, but you know, this is a product that encapsulates, you know, all the aspects of industry. So agriculture, sourcing the raw materials, and manufacturing and selling, all in a lot of cases one person. And even like Burgundy, one of the oldest wine regions, and you know, these legendary people, you make an appointment with the person, with the owner, and you can do that. And probably couldn't afford a lot of their wines, but you can still meet the person who makes the wine and whose family has done it for 14 generations. And that's pretty cool.
So talk about your most recent project that just came out, your novel Vintage. What were the influences in writing that book?
I think that one, I went to school for, I was an English major and went to school for writing, and so that novel, kind of the notes of it started at this time when I was in Missouri, really fascinated with wine. So I started thinking of this character, at that time. So, and when I was finishing American Wine Story, you know, when you're working on a film, a long piece like that, it feels like it's never going to end, and you get to a point where you just want it to be over, and you kind of curse yourself for ever starting it. And I was kind of at that point in American Wine Story, kind of fumbling around, and then I kind of dusted off this character and had been reworking it and working on a draft of that story, and it was something that I could move forward when I was stuck on the film. So yeah, it just kind of happened to come out shortly after the film too, and I think having the film out there in the public space kind of helped interest publishers in it as well. Sure. So I think it's sort of a good counterpoint to the film. So it allowed me to, you know, a lot that went into it was kind of the appreciation I gained for winemakers and the winemaking process from doing a lot of the interviews with chefs and winemakers and people for American Wine Story.
What were some of the challenges you encountered writing about wine?
Well, you know, there is an entire library of people who do it a lot better. You know, there's nothing that you can say about it because people just love it, and there's great people. You know, we have many of those people here in Oregon and in the Northwest, you know, including Catherine Cole and, you know, people around the world like Hugh Johnson. And so you can't really write anything new. So that was always the challenge. You know, it's like everything's been written about and everybody's so much more knowledgeable. So it was fun to invent a character who was an expert and put words in his mouth, you know, and that way if I got something wrong, it was like, well, that was intentional, you know, and sort of this comic, this kind of a little bit of a unreliable narrator, you know, this kind of questionable protagonist. So I could blame any of my mistakes on him. But yeah, trying to come up with something new, I think, and a new angle and a fresh perspective on something that's been so scrutinized for so long is a big challenge. But it's also a big enough subject that if you look hard enough, I think you can always find something too.
So is that something you plan to continue, the character or the type of story?
Well, yeah, I thought I would move on to some other things, but actually I'm at work on a film now called The 3 Days of Glory, about this wine festival in France. So I'm working with a wine importer in Portland who has spent a good portion of his life in France, and we kind of came up with this story. It's a really interesting time for Burgundy because the weather is changing, and 2016 they had a 70 to 90% loss of their harvest. So we thought that would be a good year to tell the story of the end of harvest celebration, these 3 days of glory in a very difficult year. So hopefully that'll kind of come out this winter. So I'm back at the point trying to make that into a story. So that's, and then I have another kind of novel that's in the wine space as well. So I find myself continuing to work on stories, and it's a sequel that includes some of the characters from the first novel. So not really a sequel, but a novel that just kind of builds on that.
So you're finding lots of inspiration in wine for lots of different projects.
Yeah, and the people too. And being able to go back to Burgundy and dig deeper into it and sort of validate some of those early experiences I had where I knew there was something special there, but I didn't know what it was. And now I understand the reasons behind it and the layers of it, and it's really fascinating. So
with 3 Days of Glory, are people coming to you with ideas now, or are these still mostly your ideas that are kind of germinating?
Well, that was one where I received an email from Scott Wright, who we interviewed for American Wine Story, and he had sold his winery and started and built up an import business, and sort of was taking a different direction to his wine career, and he said, what would it take to make a film about Burgundy? And I'm really interested in that. So we started talking and discussing some of the aspects, and he'd actually been working on a book about Le Palais, which is one of the 3 Days of Glory, the Palais de Meursault, and so it kind of grew out of that conversation. So yeah, people have see the film and kind of come up, and I've had other people too, and other ideas and suggestions for films, and there's a lot out there for sure, and so I feel like I'll be involved with it probably for quite some time.
You're actually part of the industry now.
Yeah, to a certain extent, it's great to be able to go and have conversations with people, and I feel comfortable with people. And I get that quite a bit. Sometimes I'll go somewhere and just kind of hang out or try some wines and have some, a conversation. And somebody has said, "Well, do you work in the industry?" And I don't. It's kind of peripheral. I consider it like a peripheral way to be engaged with the industry. But I feel definitely a connection to the industry, for sure, and especially here in Oregon, having talked with a lot of the original.
Sure.
The founders of the industry and gotten to know them a little bit.
So on that note, how have your perceptions of the wine industry, or Oregon specifically wine industry, changed through your connections as you've worked with the industry?
Yeah, I arrived in Oregon about 10 years ago, so it's sort of this really interesting time for Oregon. It's sort of this changeover time when you have the second generation taking over a lot of these wineries, or some of these wineries being handed over, and then you've had a lot of interest, investment by the Drom family and sort of Oregon coming of age, and then also now you have a lot of kind of corporate interests in large producers kind of buying up land and that sort of thing. So it's sort of a transitional time to look at Oregon, but I still think there's a lot of that pioneering spirit, and startup mentality that makes it really exciting. So But I do think, and maybe it's on my mind because of I think the same thing is happening in Burgundy, where you've had this really bad years of bad weather. Not that we've had pretty good weather here, but it's not been bad weather in terms of making wine, but just in delivering quantity. They still have always managed to make, exceptional wines, but the prices of the wines are going up so high that the prices of the vineyards are going up, and it's harder to continue these legacies. It's harder for small producers and the small family-style winery to exist, and I think that's they've had challenges in Burgundy. They passed rules to protect the smaller growers in the 1930s when the corporate interests of the day were looking to turn it into Bordeaux or a place like that, where there are these big houses, and it's managed to stay small producers, which I think makes it really unique. And I think Oregon has been unique because of the numbers of small producers. So I think we're at sort of a point too where we need to see, is the industry going to shift in Oregon towards big producers and big conglomerate type organizations, or is it still going to be a place that fosters these smaller entrepreneurial type growers who make really distinct wines. So I think it's an interesting time, and it's going to be sort of a challenge for the industry, and I think it's going to evolve and change. But being here while all of that's happening is pretty interesting.
So what do you think will happen, if you had to guess?
I don't know. I think, if I look at places like Sonoma, and there are still small entrepreneurial people, but I think the family estates, it'll be a little bit harder to start that from scratch than it was in the past. I think a lot of the vineyards and vineyard lands are going to be. So I think a lot of the newer growers are going to be people who come in and start a label and negotiate to get the right fruit and that sort of thing. So I think in the first generation, everybody was planting their own vineyards, and there was this sort of family legacy that's really tied directly. So I think that's going to shift a little bit, but I think it's going to they're still going to foster. There are still going to be people coming to Oregon as it's a frontier, it's a growing wine region, and its reputation is really increasing around the world too. People in Europe and France talk about Oregon. They know about Oregon. They don't buy wines from Oregon necessarily in Burgundy, or it's harder to find them. But we talk about it in American Wine Story that Thomas Jefferson had dreamt of exporting wine to France from the New World, 250 years ago or whatever, and I think we're now just at a point where American wines are winning respect in Burgundy, and particularly wines from Oregon. So, it's sort of like a fulfillment of his goal. So that's kind of a cool thing to be happening, in the new world.
You talked a couple times about sort of the generation, and you said you moved here kind of as a generational shift. A lot of the pioneers are passing down. What have you noticed about changes that have occurred because of that generational shift, or what feels different now than did a decade ago? Yeah,
and I should spend more time digging into Oregon wineries, but the scale, the size of some of the plantings in the vineyards, and the style of some of the tasting rooms have changed, and they're beautiful and they're amazing. But I think there's sort of a shift from somebody's farmhouse shed turned into a tasting room into something that's a lot more polished and a lot more spectacular. So I'm seeing more and more of those. Although there still are plenty of places where you can just kind of show up and you feel like you're on somebody's farm. But it definitely is felt in the years that I've been coming here and traveling around that there are more options on the high end, of really spectacular tasting rooms and that type of wine experience than there were in the past. There might have been 2 or 3 places that you'd recommend, but now I can think of, like, if somebody's looking for that type of experience, so there's just a number of places to go. But then there's other things happening, smaller urban winemakers and cool things happening as well, to provide a counterpoint, which is part of that Oregon sort of spirit, I think. I don't think it would ever become Napa Valley. I think Sonoma or some place like that might be more of a similar future for Oregon.
So is there, either as a consumer or as a storyteller, is there a wine that like changed wine for you? Is there a gateway wine that you remember?
Yeah, I think, well, for me, that first trip I took to Burgundy, and all I knew that the wines were expensive, and at the time, I think the wines were a lot less expensive than they are now. But this is the best place in the world to get wine. That's what I'd read on the train going to Beaune. And we went to one of the little villages, and there was some wine in a steel tank, and we tasted with this vigneron, very respected vigneron, but he was in boots, kind of splattered with grape must, and in a t-shirt, and he poured wine out of that. And I can still remember that, kind of the wine, how it smelled like the cellar that it was in where we were visiting, and even felt like the connection to the vineyards that we'd visited from the same producer on this little tour that we'd taken. So I think that wine still stands out because it was such a humble experience. This tank in sort of a musty basement is where they, was part of the process of making these wines. So, that's, we interviewed a lot of people about Epiphany wines, but that was certainly the experience, and it was probably as much at the place and the person who is still in Burgundy, and he's still making wine, and I was there last winter and drove by the domain, and it hasn't changed since the 1400s, so it's pretty cool.
Did you find that was pretty common when you're talking about Epiphany wines? Did a lot of people remember the experience maybe more than the wine?
Yep, and I think everybody has a story. Some people, more so than others, but everybody remembers, if not the wine, they remember a wine that really floored them, or that stayed with them, or that had layers. And a lot of times it's the place and the people, but other people, it was just a single bottle, that floored them. So everybody, that's a good starting point for a conversation with somebody who loves wine. What's the best top 5 wines you've ever had, and what were the circumstances around them? And people can always find it, even when they're skeptics. Like, I don't believe, there are some people, I don't believe in the Epiphany wine, but then they'll go on to tell you a story about some amazing wine experience they had. So it's sort of a common, when my mom was visiting one time, and when I was editing the film, and I showed her a little sequence, and I think it was that Epiphany wine sequence, and she's like, it's almost like a cult or a religion. And I think that experience is, or there's sort of common factors, it's like this organic religion in wine lovers.
Organic religion. Oh, I like that. Do you have a narrative philosophy or a storytelling philosophy?
Let's see. I think, I don't know, without getting too technical, but I mean, it's the old classic. I really believe in that format, it's particularly for documentary films and for anything that's a visual presentation. I think it also applies to novels to a certain extent too, or longer narrative things. But this 3-part format, the fairy tales, the beginning, the middle, and the end, the 3 little bears, the religions, 3 wise men, and the Trinity, and I think that storytelling format is baked into the human experience. And so the Greek playwrights and Greek drama had this structure, this 3-part structure, and rising action, falling action, and I think that holds true, and it's always a good starting point. It's not saying that structure has to be everything it needs to follow that structure, but it's a great starting point, and there's no reason not to follow that. And I think it's been around in the human experience long enough that it's sort of we've been naturally selected to experience that format. I think that, in the hours between, when we were hunter-gatherers, when the campfire was dying and we've eaten and, before we go to sleep, and that hour and a half to 2 hour window, I think that's the length of drama. That's when you tell stories, and I think films today, I think that's the format. That 2 hour, I think it's the great literature of our time. Film is just a continuation of that. It's plugged into a human storytelling format. So I think that 90 minutes and 3-part structure is a great place to start for any story on the video or film side. And I think it'll be around for a long time, despite cell phones and 30-second videos and YouTube and all of that. And this is the golden age of television and all of that stuff. I still think, I don't want to be a film snob, but I think that's just the superior format, or not the superior format, but it's the more human storytelling format, that longer format of a complete story. So you've already got your next couple projects lined up and you're thinking about. Is there a dream story out there for you? Is there a wine story that you just can't wait to tell? I've got something, and it started off as a documentary that didn't quite come together, and I thought it could be a nonfiction book, but I really think it would be exciting to explore the oldest vineyards in the country, and explore the wine industry from there. And we have some old ones here in Oregon and Washington, as old as any. And I think an interesting thing is that if you look at all of the oldest vineyards and the oldest wine regions, Missouri had a flourishing wine region in the 1850s because so many people came from the Rhineland. And there are still, you can go into the woods in Missouri and find an ancient Riesling vine that was planted there, long before there was established regions in California and other places where we have it today. And everybody who planted those vineyards were immigrants. And I think it's an interesting now that everybody, who labors at the lowest level of the industry are immigrants. And in some ways they have, same dreams, same ambitions, but not the same opportunities to, plant a vineyard. But I think it would be an interesting thing to look at immigration and the concept of immigration and over time, and explore some of the stories of people today moving into the wine industry or coming in as immigrants, both at the daughter of a Bordeaux winemaker being sent to Napa to learn the industry and learn the latest techniques, and then also migrant laborers coming in with ambitions and hopes to just maybe not be involved in wine, but just have better opportunity to further family. So I think there's a story there to explore of immigration's impact on the wine industry in America throughout its history. So that would be the story I'd tackle, but it seems like a pretty big and daunting story. So maybe it'll happen at some point.
That'd be awesome. I'd be interested in seeing that. Last question I have for you. We've never really had the chance to interview someone who has used our archive before. Mm-hmm. So if you wouldn't mind, just to give us an idea of what the experience was like using the archive and usefulness, impressions, things like that. Yeah,
that's part of my favorite part of the process, especially when it's so easy, the access and the collection of materials and everything, to go there and find like a treasure trove of things to be able to use in a project it's super exciting. And I remember we interviewed Dick Erath and had about a couple hours of footage, and he talked about the first wine that he ever made, and he said something like, I think it might have been a Semillon in 1956 or something like that. I can't quite remember. Then we went to the archives, and there is his notes from 1956 or 58 of the Semillon that he made. The first wine that he made is there in the archive. So he talked about it, he kind of remembered it, and then you can go and find that actual document and put that on screen, in time with the interview. I mean, that was sort of an amazing thing that can only happen, if a place like that exists. So that's like terrifically exciting to be able to, it's like a treasure for anybody who does that type of work, and an invaluable resource.
Excellent, thank you.
So, yeah.
Well, that's all the questions I have for you. Is there anything else I should have asked? Anything else you'd like to mention while we have you here?
I don't know. I think that covers a lot of it. So really appreciate it. It's amazing to be able to kind of come full circle and be on the other side of the camera rather than I prefer that side of things. So,
me too,
but
that's why I'm
it's
over here.
also honored to be able to contribute something to a great resource for the state and for the entire industry.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate that, and thank you so much for your time.